Going to be continuing with our three-part series of cognitive behavioral techniques, and today we're going to be focusing on challenging the automatic thoughts and modifying core beliefs. So, excuse me, sorry, we were talking a little bit about this last lecture in terms of thinking styles, and that in using the cognitive model, problems in living are maintained by maladaptive thinking styles. Now, when you think about offending populations, this can often be applied to what we call cognitive distortions. For example, especially with sex offenders such as child molesters, there's a large degree of cognitive distortion going on in that, many times sex offenders will believe that the children want their advances, that the children are not necessarily suffering as much as they do. Even something as much as minimizing the effect of their crime can be considered to be a cognitive distortion. Somebody who's a violent offender may distort perceptions of harm and threat in the environment such that, when they bump into somebody, it's always interpreted in a very hostile and negative manner because their schema of the world is very much the world is out to get me, and thus everything is interpreted in light of that. So according to the cognitive model, and this is really nicely explained in your Judy Beck book, there are 3 levels of thinking styles. The first are automatic thoughts, so these are the thoughts that pop into your head. The intermediate or the second level are the conditional beliefs, and then at the bottom of that is really the core beliefs or the schemas, and these are the kind of how you live your life. And as I talked to you in the analogy of psychoanalysis, this would be kind of considered to be like almost like the id. And you have to think that, as we talked about last session, both Beck and Ellis were trained in psychoanalysis, and so they were coming at it from this framework. And when you think about it, there's a lot of intuitive sense to some of the psychodynamic constructs. A lot of it can't be assessed empirically, but a lot of this stuff is just different language. It's semantics, but many times we're talking about the same thing. So this is kind of just a drawing. So at the bottom we have the core beliefs, in the middle we have the conditional rules or beliefs, and at the top we have the automatic thoughts. So on a surface level, when we start challenging cognitive distortions, we work on the surface level of automatic thoughts, and that can help, and that helps maintain us. But if you don't start modifying the underlying core beliefs, that maladaptive behavior is always going to be there. So it's kind of like being on a diet. We can cut out a certain food and we may lose weight, our blood pressure may go down, our cholesterol may go down, etc., etc. But if we don't fundamentally change the way that we view healthy eating and exercise and healthy living in general, that change is not going to endure, and it's not going to be long lasting, because the minute you get into a party where there's chocolate cake, things are going downhill, as I know from experience. So challenging core beliefs is really like making a lifestyle change. It's not 100% effective always, but that's what we're aiming for working with clients, is changing these core beliefs. So as we talked about last time, automatic thoughts are kind of stream of consciousness. So these are the thoughts that are constantly going around in our heads. We don't always observe these thoughts on a conscious level. Think about, if you're in the subway, think about all the comments that you make to yourself about the people around you. Unfortunately, most of them are probably negative, but when you start monitoring, the thoughts that you're having, sometimes it can be a little bit appalling. I did that the other day, and I was like, why do I have to be so negative? And so for every negative thought that I had, I always tried to come up with something positive, and that kind of helped me, and it made me more aware of how my thinking styles were influencing some of my behaviors. So we're constantly having automatic thoughts. Some people may be more aware of this than other people. Again, this is much easier to deal with when you have higher functioning people. Lower functioning people, again, cognitive therapy doesn't work necessarily as effectively because they have a hard time understanding A, what a cognition is, and B, kind of identifying them and then modifying them. So you may have to do more behaviorally based approaches. And people in general are generally not aware so much of their automatic thoughts, and so by doing exercises such as the DTR, which I had you do last time, and just in terms of monitoring your thoughts whenever you had an emotion, it makes people much more cognizant of what's going through their head. So as we talked about, you can notice automatic thoughts by noticing changes in motion, changes in facial expression. So this is what you want to do as a therapist. Like, I've seen this happen numerous times in therapy. I say something and people's expressions just change. Usually their faces drop, sometimes they tear up. So that's what we call a hot cognition. That's something that they just had a thought which therefore impacted their emotion. And that's like a really teachable moment in therapy. You want to kind of stop whatever you're doing and say, you know what, I just noticed that, you know, your face just changed. What was going through your head? And then you can really, in session, work through that, which is probably a cognitive distortion, and you can, you know, it really makes it much more salient. You know, when you're talking about things that happened a week ago, the emotion is not there, but when it's right in the moment, it really works to help the client understand how it affects their behavior, and also see how, by changing the way they're thinking, their mood can improve in but a few minutes. And by monitoring our thinking processes, such as using DTRs. So automatic thoughts are spontaneous, but they're generally very predictable. You know, people who have more of a depressogenic kind of personality, their thoughts are generally more, you know, this sucks, I'm a loser, kind of the triad that Beck talks about the negative view of the self, the future, and the world. So a lot of these thoughts are very predictable. If somebody has kind of a hostile perception of the world, therefore they're going to be viewing everything kind of through that lens. People who have an anxious personality are constantly viewing threat everywhere, and so their thoughts are, that's out to get me, this is out to get me, etc. And so in order to kind of make sure that we have better psychological well-being, we need to evaluate the accuracy of these automatic thoughts. Sometimes they are accurate, like, we do often have accurate thoughts about our behavior, but many times these thoughts are somewhat distorted, and therefore they can influence our mood. Now, we all have distorted thinking processes, and this is why I love cognitive therapy, because we can all work on ourselves. We can all be, more rational thinkers, and as scientists, I think that's something that we should strive towards. I mean, those of you who may or may not watch Star Wars, and that's probably before your generation, not Star Wars, Star Trek, sorry. If you think about the character Data, he was, an android, and therefore a very rational and logical thinker. And so obviously he's missing out on the humanity piece of it, but at the same time his thought processes were very, very logical. While I don't necessarily think that that is the goal, we do want to make sure that we have a higher degree of rationality in our thinking, and especially as somebody who's going to be doing counseling, you want to make sure that emotion is not necessarily involved in your counseling session, because sometimes it can cloud our judgment. And we want to be able to be as rational and objective as possible with our clients in order to help them more effectively. So, as I said, many people, and I think almost all people, I would dare say, have dysfunctional or negative automatic thoughts at some point. People who have more psychopathology tend to have more of these thoughts. I would say they dominate their automatic thought processes, whereas those people who are kind of, are functioning well may have just some, and they can deal with them, and they've developed coping strategies, or they can ignore them. And so we need to evaluate the degree to which these affect our lives. And so this is not necessarily an exercise that you're going to be doing with every patient. You want to assess, when you're doing your intake evaluation and during the course of the first few sessions, how much thinking processes really are affecting people's behavior, their quality of life. And if they're not, you may make people aware of this as something that you can do, but you may not even have to target it. You may go more into behavioral techniques or other types of exercises. So this is not something that you necessarily have to do with every patient. It can benefit most people generally. I think that, I often suggest that people read the Judy Beck book, even if they're not therapists, because I think it helps people understand their thinking processes a lot better. And, you can have a better quality of life by thinking more rationally and less emotionally. So one of the things that we want to do with our clients is evaluate automatic thoughts. So is the automatic thought dysfunctional? So what we want to do is, using our DTR, is find out what happened right before the automatic thought. So what was the stimulus that caused the automatic thought to happen? Usually there's an event. So, it can be an interaction with another individual. It can be a thought about something that happened in the past or present. It can be, something that they see on TV, etc. So you want to know what the stimulus was, the antecedent. And how did the thought make the client feel? So you want to get at their feelings and emotions, because that's how the client is going to be able to identify these automatic thoughts, because people can very much more easily identify when they're feeling sad, when they're feeling happy, angry, nervous, etc. So that's what the key for them is identifying these emotions, and therefore identifying the thoughts that underlie the emotions. How much does the client have this thought? How frequently does it happen? To what degree do they believe it? And how much are they bothered by the thought? Sometimes it's just a fleeting thought. People can say that doesn't make sense. It's not something I believe, and they go on. Other people start to ruminate on it. And it just kind of, they start spiraling downwards until things get pretty bad, and it can be very upsetting for them. So something very innocuous can then result in, a day of depression, for example. So one of the things we will do when we challenge automatic thoughts is we seek evidence. So what is the evidence that supports that thought? And what is the evidence that disproves that thought? I got a B on my paper. I'm never going to do well at school. So, what is the evidence that supports the thought that you're never going to do well at school? Well, a B is not a great grade. It may not be as good as you want it to be. But the evidence that disproves that thought just makes a lot more sense. Probably if you look at your history, you've probably had many more A's than B's. And even then, a B is a relatively good grade. It's a passing grade. You can still get into graduate school with a B. Not everybody can get A's. Only a certain amount of the population can get A's. And so B is, above average, and it's still considered to be pretty good. You can always do things to improve your paper just because you got one B. And even if you've had B's in the past, doesn't mean you can't still get an A. You can go to a writing center. You can improve your thoughts. So there's a lot of kind of looking at evidence that disproves that thought. You can also seek alternative explanations. Like, I emailed the professor on Monday and now it's Wednesday. The professor clearly hates me. And while I try to be on top of my email, I have to tell you that I do get a lot of emails every day, and sometimes, especially when I'm bogged down or I've been out of town for a day, I come home and I have hundreds of emails, and so sometimes it takes me a few days to catch up. And I can assure you that many of my colleagues are much worse than I am, and sometimes it takes them weeks to respond. So generally it has nothing to do with the student, and it's much more about the professor and the volume of emails that they receive. So you have to kind of look at alternate responses. And then you can also look at what's the worst that can happen. So you get a B. So, you may not be the top student in your class, but what's the worst that can happen? Well, I have to do a presentation for my class. I suck at presentations. I'm going to fail. Okay, that would be probably the worst case scenario, short of, urinating in your pants and throwing up. But even then, that happens, you laugh about it, you go on. It's not the end of the world. People have had those things happen and their lives are not over. Even if you fail the presentation, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fail the class. It might mean that you're going to do, not the best in the class, but it might not be that you forget you're going to fail. What's the best thing that could happen? The best thing that can happen is you go in front of your class and you're going to ace that presentation. Everybody's going to say, wow, that's the most amazing presentation that I've ever seen. Now, what's the reality of it? If you're not a great speaker, the reality probably is that you're not going to throw up or urinate in your pants. The reality is you're probably not going to pass out. You're also probably not going to do the best presentation those people have ever seen in their lives. The reality is you'll probably go up there, you'll be a little bit nervous. The presentation won't be the best, it won't be the worst, but ultimately it'll be done and you'll get a reasonable grade on it. So that's probably the reality of it. And so kind of helping people see that, that it really isn't as bad, as catastrophic as they see it is. So this is where the catastrophizing comes in, that people start thinking about the ultimate worst that can happen. And then sometimes you make people go there. Like, what is the absolute worst that can happen? And, ultimately, many times it isn't even that bad when they go there. It's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. So what is the effect of believing my automatic thought? So in one of the examples that we talked about, the woman had the thought that her husband was a little bit late in calling her, and that he was cheating on her, that he was in an accident. As a consequence of these thoughts, she really worked herself up, when in reality the most likely explanation is that maybe her husband hung up, the battery on his phone died, but as a consequence of this, she completely worked herself up. She was a nervous wreck, and she was now upset with her husband, and so probably when he walked through the door, she probably barraged him, probably resulted in a fight, and so a lot of negative things happened because she believed these automatic thoughts of hers. So what could be the effect of changing her thinking? The effect of changing her thinking could be that her evening will be much more pleasant, that her husband would not walk through the door and she would assault him I don't mean physically, but with a barrage of what were you doing, what happened, she wouldn't be upset. They'd probably have a nice evening together, and so it would be a much better situation. So I can't go and see my thesis advisor with the work I have done. They will think I am stupid. So I had actually a client who had this very belief. She was a doctoral student who was, I think, 7 or 8 years into her Ph.D., and she had actually moved away from the city in which she was studying. And it's been about 2 years since she had contact with her dissertation advisor, and she had this belief because she hadn't, she felt like the work that she had to produce was so perfect. She just too scared to send anything to her dissertation advisor, and consequently she wasn't making any progress, and she just had all these negative beliefs that they thought she was stupid. She felt negative about herself, and we kind of said, well, what's the effect of you believing this automatic thought? And the effect was that she was stuck, like she couldn't really get a job because she didn't have her PhD yet. She wasn't making any progress on her dissertation because she was too scared to send her work to her advisor. And so we talked about, what's the worst that can happen? So, the worst that happens is you send your work to your advisor, the advisor doesn't like it, and they give you some suggestions on how to work and revise it. At least you're moving, because right now she was paralyzed and not moving in any direction. And that was like a huge success story. And then, within a few sessions, she was actively working on her dissertation. And by the end of the semester, she had actually produced a very solid draft and had set a defense date for the following fall. So that was really an exciting client to work with. And you could see here the effect that the cognitive distortions were having on her, and how it was really just paralyzing her and stopping her from moving on in her life, causing depression and anxiety, and just keeping her stuck in that moment. I also like this. What would I tell a friend in the same situation? So oftentimes, it's easy to give other people advice and say, you know what, that's really not so bad. I'm sorry that happened to you, but, this can happen. So put yourself in that situation. Consider that you are the friend. You're talking to yourself. So there's no point in dating anymore. I'm so undesirable. Nobody will ever want me. So, you're on the dating websites. You have a bad date. Things don't work out. You decided to take yourself out of the dating pool. What would you tell a friend who did the same thing? You'd say, you know what, I'm sorry that you had a bad date. It really sucks and it's tough out there. But, you are a very desirable person. You have a lot of great qualities. You just haven't found Mr. Right yet. There are a lot of kind of skeevy people on these dating websites. You just have to keep on trying, and maybe eventually you'll find somebody. And that's what you would tell a friend. So why won't you take your own advice? And I think that's always very helpful and kind of a good way to kind of turn the situation around. So you also want to find out how much the person believes the dysfunctional automatic thought on a scale of 0 to 100. So the ones that are kind of, very ingrained at 100 are the ones that you want to work, are going to be the most challenging to challenge. So you might want to take some of the lesser entrenched beliefs and work on challenging those. And as you work on challenging those, you'll see that the more entrenched beliefs also might be more malleable to change. Use the questions that we just talked about to challenge the automatic thoughts, and they're available on the DTR that I have posted in the contents folder. And then after you go through the challenging questions, again ask the person how much they believe the automatic thought, and hopefully it's not as high as it was initially, that it should have gone down. And so if it's not, then you just continue to challenge until you decrease that thought. I apologize, I couldn't find the pause button, and if I press the wrong button, then the whole lecture starts recording all over again. Just had to answer the phone there. The joys of working from home. So, conditional beliefs are rules that help people cope, that people kind of have developed in order to deal with their core beliefs. So I have to succeed all the time. My house can never be messy. I always have to be perfect. These are the should statements, or the must statements, that I talked about last lecture when we talked about, those statements that people have that don't make a lot of sense when you ask them why they have to have them. So these are, but they're a way that people are able to kind of cope and make sense of their reality. And so you'll often view this as rigidity. I used to, before I had kids, and even when I initially had my daughter, before I had two more and things just completely got out of control, I had the feeling that my house always had to be perfect whenever somebody came over. So my husband it would drive my husband crazy that before, anybody would come over, I'd be like a nervous wreck and very stressed out because my house had to be perfect. And he's like, why does it have to be perfect? And I said, because it has to be perfect. And, and he's like, well, what happens if it's messy? I go, it cannot be messy. So I just, I had to have this, that my house had to be perfect. And it stressed me out tremendously. It stressed my husband out. And in fact, it caused me, from having people over at my house, because I didn't want to have people over, because that meant that I had to engage in this whole fiasco of cleaning, etc. However, with 3 kids, you soon realize that your house is never ever going to be clean again, and you just kind of give up altogether. So that's my new way of coping. But you'll see people who have perfectionistic tendencies, they always have to be perfect. And when you start doing the downward arrow with them and you get at that core belief, you'll really see kind of a breakdown when you see why they always have to be perfect. Because if they're not always perfect, that means that they're a failure, and that's very hard for them to deal with. But they can't admit that to themselves, so they just always focus on being perfect or succeeding all of the time. Conditional beliefs are often expressed as if statements. You want to listen for them when your client is talking. So if I don't do X, then I will X. Dysfunctional thoughts can be both positive and negative. So if I don't work hard all the time, then I'm going to fail. If I work hard all the time, then I'll be okay. So people have these, these statements that they live by, and they're very much ingrained in who they are. So in order to test conditional beliefs, these are things that often don't make sense, and the person can't explain them. And so you get at these using the downward arrow technique, which gets at both these intermediate conditional beliefs and the core beliefs. Now this downward arrow technique, which we'll go through in a second, is a very powerful technique, and you'll often end up getting a very emotional reaction from your clients, because this is something that they're struggling with. So they have these rules in place in order to kind of protect themselves, to defend against this core belief, which is very, very painful for them. And so when you kind of break through that and you kind of get them to recognize this core belief, you'll often see a flood of emotion, because that's something they're trying to protect themselves against, because it's too painful for them. This is also a really good way of gathering information about thinking styles, because you'll see as you kind of go through this that there's a different degree of rigidity that people have in the degree to which they believe these certain things. So the downward arrow was a strategy developed by Dr. David Burns, and he does that feeling good book. It's a really good book. I often recommend it to patients who are experiencing depression, because it's kind of like a workbook. They have like a therapist and a patient version of it, and the patient version is very good for patients to kind of understand cognitive therapy and how your thinking styles really influence your behavior. And so you really kind of take these questions and get at the core beliefs. So if that's true, so what? What's so bad about that? What's the worst part of that? What does that mean for you? And so the more you kind of pry, the more you kind of get down to the core beliefs. So just let me go through a few examples from you. So what you want to do after each automatic thought is ask a question that's shedding light on the consequences if the automatic thought came through. So one example is, I have no control over my spending, the patient tells you. So what if I can't stop spending money? What will this mean to you? It means that I'll go completely broke. Okay, so what if you go completely broke? What will that mean? Well, that means that my whole life will fall apart. So what if your whole life falls apart? What does that mean for you? It means that I'm incapable of controlling my life. So what if you can't control your life? What will that mean for you? It means that I am helpless. And so for this person, the helplessness is the core belief, the underlying belief. So once you have that core belief, that's when you identify it on a core belief worksheet that we'll talk about, and then you start kind of working at, challenging that underlying core belief using some of the similar strategies. There's also a really great chapter that I'm going to post in your content folder written by Amy Wenzel, which talks about different strategies for getting at core beliefs, because core beliefs are very much entrenched. These are kind of people's way of thinking. This is their schema, their way of viewing the world, and that's not something that you change overnight. Going back to our dieting analogy, changing your lifestyle is not easy. It's possible, but it's not easy. It means that you have to completely revamp the way that you do things, and that's kind of what a core belief is your whole thinking style. And so by changing your core beliefs, you're revamping your whole way of thinking, which is not easy. It takes time and it takes practice. And so doing these cognitive behavior worksheets, these core belief worksheets will eventually help to change these things, but there are different techniques you can use as well. So now I'm going to give you the case of Mark. So Mark is worried that an upcoming report for work is going to is not going to be up to his boss's standards, and he worries that he's not going to be good enough. So then as a therapist, you might say to Mark, okay, let's imagine that scenario actually happens. Let's imagine that you don't do a good enough job on your report and your boss tells you that it's not up to her standards. Tell me what you're worried about will happen next. Mark might say, well, if that happens, then I'll probably get a reprimand and a bad review. And then you say to Mark, what'll happen next? Then I may get passed over for a raise, or I might even lose your job. And then what? Then I'll have a really hard time finding another job with a black mark on your resume. Then what? Then everybody will see that I'm a complete failure. They'll realize that I'm a fake and I don't really know what I'm doing. So at this point, you'd probably stop, because that's probably Mark's core belief, that he's a complete failure. And so you can see that by asking these questions about something that's relatively innocuous, you can get at these really kind of deep-seated core beliefs. So here's another example, just to kind of have a visual, since I just gave you auditory examples for those of you who are visual learners, and that's also something you need to consider with your patients. So if you ever watch tapes of Judy Beck, she's always writing things down for her patients, or having the patients write them down themselves, because oftentimes it helps to see these things on paper. So this soup is awful, and if that's true, what would that mean to you? That I'm a terrible cook. And if that were the case, what would that mean to you? That I'm a bad mother. And if that was so, what would that mean to you? That I'm a failure at everything. And so that is an example of using that downward arrow technique to get at that core belief that they're a failure at everything. So we just went through the downward arrow examples. So modifying beliefs. So you get evidence that supports or disconfirms those cognitions. You do the advantages and disadvantages of holding those cognitions, cost-benefit analysis. So, if you choose, that was the good example of a cost-benefit analysis, or advantages, disadvantages was the example of the thesis student who was not able to work on her dissertation, was completely paralyzed and was just not able to move forward. So what are the advantages of not handing it in? So you might not get some negative feedback, but the disadvantages are so much greater in that you're paralyzed, you're feeling depressed, you're not able to get a job, you're not able to finish your dissertation, you're just kind of stuck and you don't know what to do with yourself. Then you can work on problem-solving strategies, kind of addressing the problem, probability charts, which Judy Beck describes in the book, and you can actually do role plays where you work through this. There's a really nice example in the Wenzel chapter that I've uploaded for you, where they talk about role playing, and often you see that these core beliefs were developed in childhood, and we our perception of things in childhood are somewhat different. An example they give is, a girl remembers that in kindergarten or grade 1, her father gives her a really hard time about doing her homework or working hard on something. And so the therapist has her, and this is then, developed her schema that my father doesn't really care about me, that I'm never good enough, and I'm kind of not good enough, I'm not lovable. And so this then was something that this woman developed throughout the course of her life, and this was one of the foundational moments that started this schema. But if she went back and she role-played her father, the therapist had her do this, and the therapist role-played her, she came to recognize that while her father may have not said it in the best way, his intentions were for her to succeed, and he wanted just the best for her. And then viewing it in this light really kind of shattered the foundation upon which this core belief was developed, kind of thinking that her father thought she was not good enough, rather than her father maybe not expressing himself in the best way, but really wanting her to do the best and to succeed. So the goal in modifying beliefs is to come up with a more reasonable belief. For example, I can still work hard, but I don't have to work hard all the time. I don't have to be perfect at everything. I am human after all. So you want to do different behavioral experiments with your clients. So you kind of work together as co-investigators and you test out hypotheses. So if the client is worried about being perfect all the time and every piece of work has to be perfect, so they spend 20 hours each day doing their work, they don't have enough time to sleep, they're completely stressed out. What if they hand in something that they don't consider to be perfect? What's going to happen? Is the world going to fall apart? And it may not be up to their standards. The boss might say, maybe do this again, but has the world fallen apart? Not so much. So you can have the patient do something like that and see what happens. This is kind of similar, to different exposures people have in anxiety-related disorders, which we'll talk about later on. So we've already talked a lot about core beliefs and schema. So these are the hypothetical structures that guide and direct thought. They allow us to filter unwanted information, attend to important aspects of the environment, and relate new information to previous knowledge and memories. So you can see this is also kind of how prejudice and discrimination is developed, because we have this way of viewing the world and we only process information that is congruent with our way of viewing the world. And so it's kind of, you'll see that people who have the belief that I'm a failure as their core belief often view the world with a negative light. Interestingly, we're doing some research now looking at cognitive measures of suicide risk, and we find that people using the Stroop task, where people have to name the word that's written in a different color and not pay attention to the color but rather to the written word, people who have things such as suicidal thoughts or depression, if you have those words written, like for example, if you have suicide written in blue and you have to have the patient say that it's written in blue, people who have those thoughts or have a longer latency to say that the word suicide is written in blue, because the word suicide activates those thoughts and it kind of gets them focused because that's part of their cognitive schema or their core beliefs. I hope I was clear about that. But if you're interested, there's a whole literature on the emotional Stroop which talks about people's response latencies to words that are salient to their psychopathology, and the hypothesis behind that is because people have these underlying schemas or core beliefs related to these words, and therefore once you have that, it kind of activates this and it kind of paralyzes people because they start thinking about these things. So core beliefs often arise from early emotional experiences, so sometimes from sexual abuse, oftentimes from our relationships with our parents, and that's why we end up blaming our parents for everything. I try to be cognizant of this and minimize my therapy costs later on in life by working as much as possible with my children. I was talking to a girlfriend of mine who has a daughter who's very introverted, which is very contrary to my friend's personality style, and she very much wants her daughter to be much more extroverted, and she pushes her a lot. And I was trying to kind of work with my friend gently. She's obviously not in therapy with me, but just to suggest that by pushing the daughter too much, that can give the daughter the suggestion that the mother is not happy with the way that she is and that she may not be good enough for the mother. And so that while she may want her to be more outgoing in social situations, and you do want people to be socially appropriate, by pushing her to be somebody she's not can result in her daughter then having the belief that her mother doesn't accept her for who she is. And my friend, definitely was open to that feedback. I always have to be careful when giving feedback to friends, which is another story altogether. Negative core beliefs can develop from negative consequences and styles of interactions with other people. So this is just kind of a diagram demonstrating pictorially what a core belief is. So some of it is a biological predisposition. Some of us, we have personality styles. So some people just might be born to be more anxious or more depressive or more avoidant. And then you have different events that reinforce those beliefs, by your early learning experiences, how people interact with you. And they interact with you sometimes because of the way that you are, because of your own personality, and that can then reinforce that. These core beliefs then influence your current thinking styles, which subsequently affect your emotions and your behavior. So the whole thing is very much intertwined. And so by getting at these core beliefs, we can then remedy some of that. So core beliefs or schemas are highly emotionally charged and represent the core aspects of our identity. And you often know that you've touched on a core belief with the downward arrow technique, as I mentioned earlier, because the patient will often start crying, or there'll be a very strong emotional reaction. And they often have similar themes like I'm a failure, I'm a loser, nobody loves me. Beck believes that core beliefs generally fall into one of two categories, helplessness or unlovability. So these are kind of helplessness thoughts. I'm helpless, I'm powerless, I'm out of control, I'm weak, I'm vulnerable, I'm needy, I'm trapped, I'm inadequate, I'm ineffective, I'm incompetent, I'm a failure, I'm disrespected, I'm defective, I'm not good enough achievement-wise. So you can see people who have very negative, childhood experiences such as they've been abused or neglected, a lot of these core beliefs can develop based on those experiences because the people who are supposed to care for them have violated that trust, and therefore people, as a child you don't understand why somebody who's supposed to be caring for you has not, and therefore, if they can't care for me, then why I'm not necessarily worth anything. Other ones are unlovability. I'm unlovable, unlikable, undesirable, unattractive, unwanted, uncared for. I'm bad. I'm unworthy. I am different. I'm defective. I'm not good enough. I'm bound to be rejected. I'm bound to be abandoned, and I'm bound to be alone. So this is in cases, where people have been left alone. There have been rejection experiences, and these thoughts become internalized. So how do you modify core beliefs? You use the core belief worksheet. I've uploaded that to your contents folder. I believe it's in the Cognitive Behavior CBT Techniques 1. So if you want to take a look at that. So what you do is you take the old core belief. So once you've used the downward arrow technique and you find the old core belief, you then look at how much that person, you start doing some of the cognitive restructuring exercises that we thought about. And you work on this because this is going to take time. This is not something that changes overnight. This is going to be, for the duration of your therapy. So how much do you believe the old core belief right now? And so this is data. So hopefully as you go through the weeks and you work on challenging these things, the belief is going to go down. Obviously there can be spikes when something bad happens that reinforces the old core belief, but generally the trend should be in a downward direction. So what's the most that you believed this week? What's the least that you believed it this week? And again, these numbers should start moving in a downward direction. So what's the new beliefs? So those are the kind of the reframes. So, I may not be, if your core belief is I'm a failure, you may believe that, well, I may not be the best at everything, but I'm definitely not a failure. There are many things that I am good at, because you'll work with people and you'll work with your client at identifying things they are good at in areas where they haven't been a failure. And so you bring that evidence to light. You might even make cards that they put around the room about things that they do that are good. You have them carry these things around with them. Post pictures on their fridge about things that they're proud of. If a parent thinks that they're a failure, like looking at your children and seeing your children succeed, that's evidence that you're not a complete failure. That you've maintained a job, that's evidence that you're not a complete failure. So then you look at how much do you believe the new belief right now. Evidence that contradicted the old belief and contradict the core belief and supports the new belief, and evidence that supports the old belief with the reframe. And so this is how you're restructuring the beliefs. Again, this is a long and tedious process. It can take a lot of time because we don't change our behavior overnight. You've been thinking like this for many, many decades probably by the point you're in therapy, and so that doesn't change overnight. But slowly but surely you can get people to modify this and improve the quality of their functioning. Generally, to get rid of core beliefs is probably not realistic. There will probably always be some remnant there, and when we're more vulnerable, in times of emotional stress, when we don't have all our resources, a lot of these things come to the surface. So you'll see that's when people, like alcoholics, those are times when people relapse. People who are on, even if you've changed your lifestyle, people might have times where they binge eat on cake, but that doesn't mean that things are over. It still means that you've made the changes, but it's normal to expect people to go back to thinking the old way because that's what they were used to, or eating the old way, or having a drink, and you just kind of pick yourself up and go on and say, I've made all these changes and I can go back. So hopefully that's helpful to you. Again, Judy describes that very nicely in her book. And again, the Wenzel chapter is also very helpful. And if you have any questions about, DTRs, let me know. That's your assignment for blog number 2, is to conduct a DTR. You're not going to be doing the challenging of the core beliefs, but you will be doing some cognitive restructuring. There are good examples starting on page 192 of the Beck book. And if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to contact me.